Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.
We are now going over to questions to the Prime Minister. I will be running the questions for 45 minutes. I will call the First Secretary of State to answer the engagement questions. And can I welcome to the dispatch box?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've been asked to respond on behalf of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister.
The Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, was there, First Secretary Dominic Raab and Labour's new leader, Sir Keir Starmer. Most of the MPs, though, were not at Prime Minister's questions. They had to be beamed in via Zoom. And Boris Johnson himself was also absent, still recovering from coronavirus. But the Evening Standard's editorial column is pleased the Commons is making at least some noise again.
The House of Commons' return is an important signal that parliamentary democracy continues, even, in fact especially, in national crisis. The benefit of the doubt given to the government in the early weeks of the pandemic is giving way to a legitimate probing of the promises made and the problems in delivering them. The Prime Minister's absence from the helm as he quite rightly recuperates may be an explanation for the drift at the centre of government, but that too is not an excuse. The health of 60 million people cannot wait on the return to health of one person. Either Boris Johnson is well enough to lead, which we hope he is, or else the vacuum has to be filled by others.
Well, Evening Standard columnist Ayesha Hazarika literally wrote the book on Prime Minister's questions. It's an insider's guide called Punch and Judy Politics, and she's with me over Zoom now. Ayesha, you've sat through many's a PMQ. Did this format work?
I was surprised at how well it worked. I was quite nervous about how it would work. I mean, obviously the interaction between Keir Starmer and Dominic Raab was still as normal. That was just across the dispatch box, so that wasn't a huge change.
So I will be calling Sir Keir Starmer and welcoming in his first outing to the dispatch box. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank you, the House authorities and the staff for allowing us to meet in this way today, because it's important that we have this scrutiny.
I actually thought that the virtual PMQs was almost worked slightly better for the backbench questions, because first of all, you could actually hear what people were saying without all the noise. Secondly, because people were going to be on television, I think they made a bit of an effort to keep their questions quite short and snappy and to the point. Sometimes in Parliament, you kind of see somebody stand up and it's a bit of a rambling stream of consciousness. Sometimes you're like, is there a question coming? I'm not sure. But thirdly, wasn't it interesting to have a wee glimpse into people's homes? It was like sort of political through the keyhole, which, let's be honest, who doesn't like a wee snoop around everyone's houses?
Something else that was new today was Labour's new leader, Sir Keir Starmer. Totally very unusual circumstances for someone to have to do the first PMQs. How did he do?
Most new leaders will be absolutely quaking in their boots about doing PMQs, and I'm sure kind of Keir Starmer was kind of similar, but it was a very, very different setup. It didn't have the sort of heat and the rowdy heckling and a full chamber. But that didn't mean that it wasn't going to be any less stressful, because I think your debut outing, you know that all eyes are on you. And I think he did really well. And I think why he was good was that he set out his stall from the beginning.
Mr. Speaker, I promised that we would give constructive opposition with the courage to support the government where that's the right thing to do. And we all want and need the government to succeed in defeating coronavirus. But we also have to have the courage to challenge where we think the government is getting it wrong.
And I think that is the right tone for his leadership. But for me, the other thing which was so crucial, as somebody who has really studied PMQs, that was my job for over 5 years when I was a political advisor for the Labour Party. I've written a book about it, Punch and Judy Politics. But for me, his delivery and his style and his performance were really, really interesting. You could tell that he was a lawyer. You could tell he was very, very comfortable with the idea of asking questions, listening to the answer, calibrating a response, coming back, he's a good debater in an effective but grown up and courteous way. You can tell he's somebody who is very comfortable in a courtroom. And interestingly, today, the unique circumstances of the social distancing, quite an empty chamber, lots of TV screens, it actually was quite similar to a courtroom.
Yeah, when I was watching it, I felt this is like a courtroom. It's because of, like you said, there's so little noise. Now, we all love the boisterousness of PMQs, the hears and the boos and the yahs and everything. But when you pull all that away, you get the real politics, don't you?
I mean, I often defend the ferociousness and the rowdiness and the bawdiness of the chamber. And I think that is quite an important part of our sort of, our kind of, the theatre of our democracy. And I think it does have its place. But I think what we haven't seen in Prime Minister's questions for such a long time are people that can sort of, cut through the heat and the sound and the fury. But a note of caution: new leaders, whether they're the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition, always get a good run at their first PMQs. It's sort of like a kind of an unspoken rule of British politics. You have to be absolutely terrible to fluff your first PMQs. This was very, very unusual circumstances. And remember, the future, if he does have any future interactions with Dominic Raab, they don't really matter that much. Yes, they're going to be watched, but they're mainly the dress rehearsal for the real debut, which is going to be against Boris Johnson. And that could be a very, very different scenario. And of course, when the chamber comes back and you've got 650 people braying and heckling and making a lot of noise, and of course the Prime Minister, I actually don't think Boris Johnson is a brilliant debater, but he does have the noise of all the Tory MPs behind him. He will have that wall of sound.
Yeah, when that all returns, that's really Boris Johnson's playing ground, isn't it? He thrives on that. I do wonder, much as lots of MPs will be sitting watching PMQs and going, I can do that one day, I wonder how, when you get the ferociousness of that coming back to you for the first time, how intimidating that must be, actually.
It's hugely intimidating. And I think pretty much every single person we interviewed for our book who had done PMQs, who had stood at the dispatch box, including the editor of our newspaper, George Osborne, he stood in for David Cameron a couple of times. Pretty much everybody said that it's absolutely terrifying, that there is a fear which is not just in your head, your whole body feels the fear. Tony Blair said that anxiety and the sort of visceral, your body is in kind of like fight or flight mode. It never ever goes away. The only person we spoke to who said that he did actually feel pretty comfortable at the dispatch box, and I think he is quite unusual, was William Hague. He was a really skilled debater, and he has been a skilled debater from when he was a kind of a young chap, when he was sort of in his teens. So I think he had quite a unique gift at being very, very quick-witted. He absolutely loved that environment, but most people we spoke to did say that it is absolutely terrifying. And I remember the first time I sat in the actual chamber when I was a special advisor. This is when Harriet Harman stood in for Gordon Brown. I just remember, I don't think I had ever really heard noise like it. It's a really unique noise. It's so loud. It's a noise that you don't just hear in your ears, you sort of feel it in your sternum. You feel your sternum reverberating. It's very much like walking into sort of an amphitheatre as a gladiator. So I think you're only human to feel nervous about it. And you're right, it's very easy for backbench MPs and commentators and everybody else to, be the armchair critic on it. But very few people in politics will have ever had to stand at the dispatch box and actually face that. So it's quite a unique privilege to have been at the dispatch box, and a very unique experience.
Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.